I am going to be giving a presentation called, as Alan said, Inside the Dream Factory. And what I want to do today is something a little bit different. Many people have heard me speak about my 21 years at the Ministry of Defense, only 3 of which were actually spent on the UFO project. So although I'm best known for that, actually it was just one tour of duty out of a much wider Ministry of Defense career. What I want to do is slightly get away from some of the things that maybe participants in this online meeting will have heard from me before, and give you what I think I referred to in the blurb as the water cooler moments. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that I want to get away from a straight presentation about the UFO project, the declassification and release of the MOD files, some of the good cases like Rendlesham Forest, Gosford incident, the Calvine incident. Many of you will have heard me discuss this before, but what I want to do today is, as I say, something a little bit different. I want to put some of this in its geopolitical context, and I want to add some color. I want to give people a sense of what it was actually like working inside the Dream Factory, being not on the outside looking in, but on the inside looking out. And to do that, I'm going to give you a series of anecdotes, but I'm going to start just really with some facts and figures. And by the way, just picking up on Alan's point about declassification of files, I do later in this presentation want to just address what's coming later this year from the British Ministry of Defence and the ongoing program to declassify and release the UFO files. And of course, with the overall theme of disclosure in mind, I do want to address the whole Hillary Clinton, John Podesta dynamic, as this has generated certainly a lot of mainstream media coverage, which is quite interesting in and of itself, and certainly a huge buzz and expectation in the UFO community. We'll get into that. I can't tell you exactly how today is going to pan out. I'm going to speak between maybe 45 and 60 minutes, and then I want to throw it open to Q&A, because I think it's maybe perhaps in the spirit of what you're all trying to organize with this event, that we maybe make it a little bit more interactive than some of the physical conferences, and make people feel that they're not just listening to the speakers, but certainly, and this is what I have in mind, that you become part of the event yourselves. So my final thank you in these introductory remarks is to everyone else who is there. And my apologies, I'm new to Zoom, so I can't actually see yet, maybe I'm not pressing something, a list of other people in the room. But after my formal remarks, I guess I'll go to Q&A, and perhaps I'll see who's there. So let me kick off then with that introductory statement out of the way. I guess with, I've seen a little sidebar pop up there, and I'm seeing little messages, so I'm guessing that's all good stuff. Thank you, whoever did that for me remotely. And thank you for the comment. I think it was Alan there at the bottom. I will, as the meeting goes on, try to pick up on everything that flashes up, and apologies if I don't get to everyone. First off, a lot of people, I talk about the Ministry of Defense, and it may sound a silly point, but maybe I should just take a moment to say what the Ministry of Defense actually is, because I think some people have a slightly better idea than others about that. The way that I usually describe it is that the UK Ministry of Defense is broadly analogous to the US Department of Defense. But it's interesting that it has a dual role. It is a policy-making Department of State with a full Secretary of State for Defense who sits in the cabinet in the UK and is part of the wider political decision-making process. But the Ministry of Defense is also the UK's highest military headquarters. It's a headquarters, and it's at the highest level. It sits above the permanent joint headquarters, and certainly above any in-theater headquarters if we're conducting operations, for example, in Iraq or Afghanistan. So it has that dual role, and people will say, for example, who's in charge of the Ministry of Defense, and it's actually quite a complex issue, because there is the Secretary of State for Defense, who is the senior politician there, an elected member of Parliament appointed by the Prime Minister to be Secretary of State for Defense, and he or she sits at the top of that particular pyramid. But there is also the Chief of the Defence Staff, who is the UK's senior serving military officer. CDS also sits in the Ministry of Defence and has direct access to Her Majesty the Queen on any military issues, and is, of course, the senior military person that the government will turn to for advice on all military affairs. And then there is the permanent undersecretary, the senior civil servant in the Ministry of Defence. So it's quite a complex relationship where you have both the politician, Secretary of State for Defence, the military officer, Chief of the Defence Staff, and the civil servant, the permanent undersecretary. And any of you out there who have ever watched the marvellous British comedy Yes Minister will have an insight perhaps into the machinations of government departments and the kind of sometimes fractious relationship that there is between the civil servants and the politicians. And, you know, of course it's exaggerated and it's comedy, but it has its roots in tensions and realities that are there. So for anyone that hasn't seen it, it's quite a fascinating and fun series. So check out Yes Minister and the follow-up series Yes Prime Minister. All good stuff. The Ministry of Defence is geographically situated in Whitehall in London. And Whitehall is the part of central London where many government departments have their headquarters. And it's a stone's throw, literally, from Downing Street. Indeed, in 1991, when the IRA launched a mortar bomb attack on Downing Street, we, people working in Ministry of Defence main building, heard and indeed felt the explosions of the mortars. And in fact, we were told to duck and cover, and you know, somewhat undignified, I guess, but literally we were taking cover under our desks in case of further attack. But that's geographically where we are. And the UFO project, incidentally, was situated on the 8th floor. So we had one of the best views in the building. I don't know why. They probably figured that we had to be high up, maybe to see the object of our search. There are, in the Ministry of Defence, I mean, it is building, it's a building of about 1 million square feet. Again, you can Google all this. You can have a look at some images of it and some of the facts and figures that I'm going to get into to give you a flavour of building and what it was like working there. There's quite a lot of information these days available online. So as I say, it's 1 million square feet, 9 stories up. UFO project was on the 8th. It goes down a long way too. And I'm probably not allowed to say how deep it goes down. This will probably start various conspiracy theories, but there are subterranean parts of the building too. There's the Defence Crisis Management Centre, where I was seconded during the Balkans crisis and during the parts of the Second Gulf War. And there are all sorts of rumors about tunnels and underground parts of the building and what it links to. And even those of us who worked for many, many years in the building. We heard stories, but we didn't know. There'd always be someone you'd run into who says, "Oh yes, it goes down even deeper than you've been or know about." So there are mysteries about the building, even for those of us who worked in it. And there were a lot. There were a lot of us. There were about 3,300 people who worked in Ministry of Defence main building. And we always used to say that at the time of the Falklands War, there were actually about the same number of people working in Ministry of Defence main building as there were in the Falkland Islands that we went to war over. So interesting statistic, maybe. What else am I going to get into about the building itself? One of the most intriguing things about the building is that although it's a very modern build, it was constructed around the shell of a much older building. And indeed, several hundred years ago, it was the site of the old Whitehall Palace. Whitehall literally means a derivation of the Whitehall Palace, one of the old palaces of the kings and queens of England that was literally painted white, and it was right by the River Thames. So although the building was a relatively modern construct, down in the basement there are parts of the old foundation of the old Whitehall Palace. And one of the really bizarre things is that the old wine cellar constructed for King Henry VIII, so we're talking back in the 16th century, the old wine cellar is still there, pretty much brick for brick, as it was 500 years or so ago. And it was a Ministry of Defence tradition that promotion parties and leaving dues were held in the wine cellar. You could hire it free of charge if you were an employee. You could book it effectively, and you would have your function in there. And it's an extraordinary piece of history. It's like stepping into a time machine. One moment you're walking along these corridors of a modern government headquarters building, and the next thing you come to a little arched door, a huge thick wooden door. It swings open, and you're back in almost medieval Middle Ages, and there you are with these vaulted ceilings. It's very cool down there. Of course, that was the point, because it's underground and because of the shape of the building. Members of the public can go on a list with the Heritage Agency, I think, and once a year they let members of the public in on a very limited basis. If you're a real history buff and you're on that waiting list for long enough, and of course you have to be escorted by Ministry of Defence police. You can't just wander off. But for those of us who were there, it was a really wonderful thing to behold and to be a part of. And don't worry, we'll get into UFOs. But as I say, this is water cooler moments, and I really want to give people perhaps something they've never had before, that kind of window, that sense of what it was like working there. And again, with that in mind, I want to say that of the 3,300 people working there, it's a mixture of, obviously at the top level, as I mentioned, we have the politicians, the Secretary of State for Defense and the Undersecretaries of State. In my day, it was predominantly civil servants, and people worked in divisions that were pretty much either civilian, like myself, or military. But those barriers were broken down, and some time ago it was felt that not only were there benefits in what we called jointery, in other words, the military working not just on an Army, Navy, Air Force and Marines basis in silos, but we called it purple, because that's the combination when you mix the combinations of colors together: green for the Army, blue for the Air Force, light blue for the Air Force, rather dark blue for the Navy, you would get purple. Purple working means that you have these divisions with Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, all of them pooling their expertise. You also throw in the civilians, perhaps the Ministry of Defense, police too, and you get much better joined up working than we did back in 1985 when I joined, where, as I say, most divisions were very much, say, either it was an Army division, it was a civilian division, or whatever it was. But now you can walk into any directorate, doesn't matter what it's responsible for. It could be personnel, could be finance, could be doctrine, could be training, and you'll find this mixture of the different branches of the armed services and the civilians, all working alongside, all bringing their very different knowledge, background, and mindset to the table. And that is something that in my 21-year career I saw change, and that was very interesting. Another thing that I saw change, and this will be the last thing I'll go into in general terms before I get into UFOs a little bit, but the other thing I saw, an extraordinary change, was that this headquarters building some years ago was refurbished, and we were all decanted, as they called it, into other Ministry of Defense buildings elsewhere in London. They gutted the whole building, and when we returned, it was pretty much entirely open plan. Now, I mean, literally all modern, swish headquarters, everyone in cubicles, that sort of thing. And a lot of people had been very against this. A lot of people had said, well, look, we all deal, or many of us deal with so highly classified subjects that how can we have these open plan offices where somebody could wander through and hear? I mean, we've all got security clearances, of course, but it's at different levels. Those of us with TSSCI, and of course the need to know principle applies to everyone. So a lot of people, particularly defense security, where ironically I ended up working in my final tour of duty, were very against the idea. So we had a compromise. We had these secure meeting rooms where people would break out and discuss highly classified subjects. But the argument for going open plan was that it would encourage you to talk to your colleagues more. And to give you an example of how that worked very well in practice, I mentioned that my last posting was in the Directorate of Defense Security. Now, defense security had been split into about 5 or 6 different areas. Counterterrorism, personnel security, vetting, in other words, industrial security, managing the process for when defense contractors had access to classified information, IT security, cyber security. All these different areas, all part of the security matrix, and yet in the old non-open plan way of doing business, you would have what I mentioned earlier, people working in silos. In other words, they would be very much focusing on their own narrow area, but they would have a less comprehensive understanding of what colleagues on related business were doing. And when the walls came down and when we went open plan, surprise, surprise, even within the Directorate of Defense Security, we found that it worked, because we found, for example, that the industrial security people would talk to the personnel security people, the vetting process, everything would be slotted in. The counter-terrorism, of course, post 9/11, counter-terrorism ran right to the heart of a lot of business, not just in defense security, but in the MOD as a whole. And we found that the benefits of better collaboration amongst colleagues far outweighed these initial security concerns, which, as I say, were met by means of having these secure areas where people could go to discuss the most highly classified business. I hope those introductory remarks have given people perhaps a better flavor of Ministry of Defense than they had before. I think all too often when people hear me on the radio, see me on television, hear me at a conference, for example, I just launch straight into, at the Ministry of Defense, we did this or we did that. And people perhaps didn't have that contextualization of what we were all about. So I hope that's been a useful scene setting. And I want to do the same briefly for the MOD UFO project itself. As I mentioned, the office was on the 8th floor of Ministry of Defense main building. We had just 4 people in the office. There was my boss, who sat at higher executive officer level. Let me just do the kind of military equivalence thing. We were all civilians, but at when you kind of look at the military civilian equivalence table, which decides who writes whose report, when they say what grade equates to what rank in terms of the structure. I was at the time at pretty much the junior managerial level in civilian level, which equated to a army captain. And so my boss, a higher executive officer, would have been a major at that level had he been in the military. There's a table that you can look up somewhere with all this. I think NATO puts one out. Just to be confusing, NATO used the designators OF, I believe. And just to be doubly confusing, we all changed our titles midway through my MOD career. So trying to explain the MOD's rank structure as a kind of dark art in itself, I won't even go down that road unless anyone wants to. And even if they do, I'm struggling to remember some of the acronyms and letters and number combinations myself. I finished up as what we called a B2, which was I guess a deputy director level. So I was one of the deputy directors in Director of Defense Security. The UFO project, getting back to that, had 4 people in the office, my boss, 2 people at my level, and somebody who provided administrative support. And we all had other things that we did as well. Even though I was pretty much running the UFO project, I had some other responsibilities. One of the slightly odd things that I found myself doing was vetting manuscripts written after the Persian Gulf War. And I found myself part of the, I suppose this was before the UK even had a Freedom of Information Act, but I found myself literally as the person with the black pen going through the memoirs of the senior officers wanting to write their accounts of what happened during the Persian Gulf War. I found myself the one saying, wait a minute, isn't that still classified? I think we'd better take that sentence out, and blacking it out with a large black pen, and thus getting into very angry 3-way discussions with retired military officers, often at high level, publishers, and the Ministry of Defense hierarchy, who of course wanted, particularly pre-FOI, as little of this out as possible. But the bread and butter of my job, of course, was the UFO research and investigation. And again, to give you those water cooler moments that I promised, there was no real, I suppose, headhunting process in terms of belief on this. I think it's a common misconception that they always recruit a skeptic into that job. That's not always the case. I really wasn't offered I offered the job on the basis of being a skeptic. I was sounded out about the vacancy, and I was asked what I thought, and I said, well, it sounds fascinating, but I really didn't know much about UFOs. I had no prior interest in the subject, no particular belief either way. So I was certainly not a hardcore skeptic when I came into that job, as some people have suggested I was, I think, much more just curious about what I would find out. So there was no requirement to get a skeptic into that position. I was, I suppose, headhunted. I was in a different part of the division at the time, and it was simply part of internal reshuffle. I'd done a couple of other posts since 1985 at firstly at a junior administrative level, and secondly at the junior executive level. So I joined as a young executive officer, and I was in this junior managerial position. So the way the structure of the MOD worked, we all wanted, I suppose, the most prestigious jobs that were available. And most times those are the ones, for example, in the private office of the Secretary of State for Defense. And those were the sorts of jobs that I had applied for once I'd attained the junior managerial position, because I thought if I was to get on a fast track to much higher things, and you know, some people aren't ambitious, but I certainly was, and most of my intake was. We wanted those good jobs, and I didn't get one of those postings, unfortunately. But I was in a secretariat division. The UFO project was embedded in a directorate called Secretariat Air Staff. Those secretariats were considered good jobs. There was a secretariat for the air staff, for the Navy, for the Army. There was a secretariat for overseas commitments. There was a secretariat for NATO. So I was well placed. It was a good area. A lot of graduate, high flying people with their eyes on the top. And then I was kind of knocked sideways because I was already in this secretariat division, and there was a reshuffle. And immediately before my time on the UFO project, I had been seconded into the Joint Operations Center, as it was then called, now the Defense Crisis Management Center. And I had been doing watchkeeping duties in relation to the first Gulf War. We were the people doing the 12 hours shifts. So, you do 12 on, 12 off for a week and alternate between day and night. And you would literally be sat at the desk waiting for something to happen. It might be a successful bombing raid against an Iraqi military target, or it might be the tragic news that a British military aircraft had been shot down. Whatever it was, it might be a problem about securing diplomatic clearance for an aircraft to get out to the Gulf region. It could be absolutely anything. It could be a visit of a member of the royal family or a senior politician. But we were the people there literally waiting for the things to happen, briefing them up the chain of command, and then inputting to the all-important briefing cycle. So they would come very quickly to all of us and say, what are the key events that had happened? And I'd been working there, and I had impressed, I suppose, the person next up the chain of command as being a safe pair of hands. And he said, look, I have this vacancy coming up in the internal shuffle, the reshuffle, and I'd like you to come and work for me. And I said, what's the job? And he said, UFOs. And I kind of raised my eyebrows and said, how's that going to be good for my career? And he said, well, it'll probably be better for your career than turning down a job. So a kind of emotional blackmail in one respect. But of course, human nature being what it is, I couldn't help but wonder what that job was. I, like all of the people, had seen it in the MOD telephone directory itself at the time, quite a highly classified document. And there was one name. We used to flick through this document to help us research what other jobs were out there that we might want to apply for at level transfer or hopefully promotion. And there was this one job, and it just very mysteriously said UFO. And of course I wanted to know, so I said, okay, I'll take the job. And I I did that for the next 3 years of my life. And I've talked in some detail about some of that, but for those that are new, again, just to give you a flavor of it, there was no typical day in that job. People ask what was the average day like. Very difficult to tell. Obviously, the bread and butter of it was investigating the newly reported cases that came our way, and we got about 200 or 300 each year. I might literally come in and find the phone ringing, pick it up, and find it could be anyone. It could be a member of the public. The number was broadcast. There was a public hotline, but it might equally be a military officer, a pilot telling me about a sighting, a radar operator, a police officer, could be anyone. So some of the calls, some of the reports came into us via telephone. Some came in at the time. This was all before email. Some of them came in via military signal. We had a signals machine that would literally, rather like a sort of glorified fax machine, this long strip of paper would come cascading out, and it might contain in it a report of a UFO sighting that had been maybe reported to a military base, and then someone in the comms center there had signaled it through to us in headquarters. Sometimes an old-fashioned letter would arrive, UFO desk, UFO project, Secretariat Air Staff, however people addressed it, Ministry of Defense main building, Whitehall, London. And literally the post would arrive, and the clerks, the admin staff would sort it through. And as it was in those pre-email days, literally one of the admin staff would come in and put your work in the in tray. There were usually 3 trays, one marked in, one marked out, and one marked pending. So you would get the UFO reports all sorts of ways. And as I say, the bread and butter of the job would be researching and investigating these newly reported sightings. Some of them were very quick and easy. White, red, and green lights seen near a military base or a civilian airport. I mean, self-evidently, you're dealing with an aircraft. But we would check. We would try never to make assumptions. And we would, of course, have at our disposal one side of the office had a huge map on it. What we had marked on that map was every military base in the United Kingdom, all the civilian airports, the flight paths, the ranges and danger areas and proving grounds where we would do military exercises. We had the location of weather balloon launches. We had access to information about satellite tracks, rocket re-entries, all manner of things that give rise to mistaken reports in people's minds. So the first thing we would do is literally we would put an X on the spot. X marks the spot. And we would say, where is that location? What do we know about what was going on, say, at 2 in the morning last night? Yes, there was a night exercise with special forces involvement. They were dropping parachutists using flares. Clearly, that's what someone has seen. And we would go through what was a process of elimination. What did the UFO sound like it might be? What was the location, and what were we aware was going on in that location at the particular time? So that was, as I say, the bread and butter of the job. But there were other strands to it as well. From time to time, a question would be asked about UFOs in Parliament. And we had 2 strands to this. One was called a PQ and one was called a PE, Parliamentary Question, Parliamentary Inquiry. A parliamentary question is a formal written question. It's a very archaic British process. Member of Parliament has to go to the Speaker's office and formally lay down a question which says to ask Her Majesty's government how many UFO reports were received in the last year, and if the government will make a statement. In fact, for PQs, it is to ask the Secretary of State for Defense. So it would be to ask the Secretary of State for Defense how many UFO sightings reported last year, and maybe in the last 10 years, and if he will make a statement. And PQs arrived in a menacing green folder with a red tag on them, and they were usually hand delivered instantly by people working in the Secretary of State's office. And this was really what was known as a drop everything moment. And they would have printed in menacing text on the front, ministerial business to be given priority at all times. And you would have a deadline, and you had to get the answer back by that particular deadline. So dealing with these parliamentary questions was really a kind of scary thing. You've got to get absolutely everything right. And the scariest thing of all was what was known as an oral parliamentary question, as opposed to a written one. A written one, you just give a statement and it's printed in Parliament. The oral one, you give a written answer, but it's followed by a Q&A, and you don't know what the Qs, the follow-up questions are going to be. So you, as the subject matter expert, have to guess what the MP, the Member of Parliament, is getting at. So you have to look up in the record what his or her particular interests are. You have to look up what he or she has asked previously. And you have to make an informed assessment of what they are likely to come up with. So you come up with what's called a defensive Q&A. And it's like, well, if she asks this, here's your response. If she asks that, that's your response. And we guide, this is real yes minister stuff. Again, we gently guide the Secretary of State and the other Under Secretary of State into the best answers that we can give on this. They have to be truthful answers. To give knowingly a false answer to Parliament is a resignation offence. It will kill a political career. So certainly in the UK, I know people come up with this phrase, oh, politicians lie all the time. Well, no, they don't in the UK, and if they get caught at it's a career-ending situation. What politicians will do, of course, is spin heavily. So good news will be talked up, bad news will be downplayed, or perhaps not mentioned at all. There's a very unfortunate anecdote which illustrates this, in that on the day of 9/11, the British government, of course, always has to publish a range of statistics and make news announcements on all sorts of topics. And a very senior press officer came in and said words to the effect, after 9/11 had happened, this is a good day to bury bad news. In other words, if you have to make announcements of, for example, statistics that show job losses, now's a very good time to put them out, because nobody's going to be looking at job loss statistics on the day of 9/11. And again, this gives an insight, I guess, into how politicians sometimes think and how civil servants advise them. So again, that kind of business, parliamentary questions, was another side of what we did. Media inquiries would come in via the press office, and again, we would have to, particularly if it was a national daily newspaper, they were hugely, still are, influential in the UK. I mean, the Times of London, the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian, but also the tabloids such as the Sun. They always used to say that the political correspondent of the Sun was the most powerful person in the United Kingdom, could decide an election with a particularly powerful feature that on election day that maybe ended with a plea to vote a particular way. So again, inquiries from the media would drop everything moments where you would have to craft a response to the media that was truthful, but put things in a light that we wanted. And our policy with UFOs absolutely was to downplay the full extent of our interest in this. We used phrases such as no defense significance, limited defense interest. And we used these sound bites to try to persuade the media to either drop stories on UFOs, or if they were going to run them in a very tongue-in-cheek way that would perhaps discourage serious interest. The last thing any of us wanted was a serious journalistic inquiry into this along the lines of, say, Woodward and Bernstein looking at the Pentagon Papers and Watergate. We far preferred the kind of light-hearted treatment that this subject got, because really it would then discourage serious interest. So every time the press office could get the phrase little green men into a story, we chalked it up as a success. Every time we could throw the phrase flying saucer in, which certainly in our time was an archaic term, again, it was chalked up as a success. You would almost literally roll your eyes and say, well, if people are seeing flying saucers and little green men, I guess that's their prerogative, but we have more serious things to do, like the situation in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, no journalist wanted to be seen siding with the cranks, so they would kind of laugh along and say, oh, yeah, absolutely. And sure enough, 9 out of 10 media stories that appeared about UFOs would use these sorts of phrases, little green men, and would almost never tell the story in a straight fashion, would almost never ask searching questions of the Ministry of Defense, questions which now, of course, I acknowledge should have been asked, but that was the policy that we were operating to. Again, water cooler moments. The Daily Post bag could bring anything. It brought, on occasion, a letter from a school child saying, we are doing a project on UFOs, can you send us some information? And we would do our level best to help. It was good public relations. We were mindful of our public image in all things, and of course we wanted to be helpful. So when I say there was no typical day in the UFO project, I'm not just being cliched about it. There really wasn't. One day we could have a parliamentary question and the Secretary of State's office screaming at us for answers. Next moment we could have, dear Ministry of Defense, I am doing a project. Please send us your best information about UFOs. Are we really being visited? And we would send very polite letters back saying, well, not as far as we know, but there are certainly some fascinating sightings. And we would try to send some statistics, maybe some photos and some magazines. We had a vast supply of things that we'd been sent over the years. We'd sometimes just send out a UFO magazine sent to us from, say, one of the UFO groups, just to pass it on and to show how sort of media friendly and public relations minded we were. Now I'm conscious that I've spoken for about, I think, 50 minutes, so I'm going to wrap up in about 10 minutes and throw it open to you, certainly for the last half hour, for something more interactive and Q&A. But before I do so, I want to cover two other subjects very briefly. First one is quick and easy. When are the next Ministry of Defense UFO files coming out? I've had a lot of people asking me that. Obviously, when I've been a spokesperson for this, I've done, a zillion TV and radio and newspaper interviews on the previous ones. We thought in June 2013 that it was the last batch, but we found a we found I think 18 files that had not been released. They will be out this year. Again, they have been passed to the National Archives, the Ministry of Defense. There had to be a process of redacting these files. In other words, going through them to make sure that there's no classified information. So they've been declassified. As for when public release will take place, I don't know the precise date yet. It will be this year. It could be as soon as this month. As soon as I know anything, I will try to say so. But very often, of course, there's a media embargo, and I'll be asked not to break that. So it may just be that you have to wait for coverage of this in the press. Sadly, there will be no smoking gun. There won't, in these final UFO files, be a sort of spaceship in a hangar revelation. But as with previous batches, there will be some fascinating cases, pilot sightings, radar visual cases, and there will be some interesting internal Ministry of Defense policy documents too, talking about how we viewed this subject. So it will be a mixed bag, and there will be those letters from school children and letters from the public with their UFO sightings too. So it really will be several thousand pages, I think. So far we've had about just short of 60,000 pages of documentation released. There'll probably be another few thousand here, maybe 2,000-3,000, something like that. Some will have been quite highly classified at the time. Most will have just been unclassified. A lot of it is just letters to and from the public. So watch this space for the conclusion of what will have been really quite an extraordinary 8-year program to declassify and release these files. And I'm sure once they're out there, I can't make any comment, of course, about material that the government itself has not yet released, but as soon as they're out there at the National Archives, I'll be doing some media interviews, and I'm sure be making some comments on that. The final point I want to make is about disclosure, and I have received many questions asking me when I think, if and when I think disclosure will come, and particularly what I think of the whole unfolding situation with Hillary Clinton and John Podesta, and some of the extraordinary statements that have really been made about this over the last few weeks and months. And it is extraordinary. Even I have been surprised by the way that this has panned out. Why have I been surprised? The reason I've been surprised is the tar baby, the third rail effect that UFOs normally has in the political process. Think back to when Dennis Kucinich was seeking the Democratic nomination. If you remember that moderated Q&A where suddenly he was hit with a question about the UFO sighting that he'd had with Shirley MacLaine, and how he'd said, apparently, and Shirley MacLaine had wrote this into her autobiography, that they had both seen it and they both had thought that it was a deeply spiritual and meaningful experience for them. Well, it's hard to put your finger on a single moment that ends a political career, or certainly the aspiration of presidential office. But that certainly did Dennis Kucinich no favors at all. I mean, a politician can be loved or hated. They kind of take that on the chin. But once a politician starts being laughed at by the media and the public, that really is almost the worst place to be in. And that question, really done in not an aggressive way, but almost that light-hearted flying saucer little green men that we in the MOD did, was absolutely devastating. So you would think that any political candidate would have seen that and seen how it played out, and would not want to touch this subject at all. And yet, John Podesta has made repeated tweets about this. Podesta, of course, was President Obama's, he headed up the transition team after Obama was elected president. Then he became President Obama's chief of staff, and he's now Hillary Clinton's campaign manager. And yet he's making these repeated tweets about UFOs. When he left the White House, my biggest regret, not getting the UFO files released. Tweets about Area 51, more tweets about UFO files and related topics. And Hillary Clinton, too, instead of kind of slapping down her former chief of staff and said, come on, let's get off this, she brings it up. Firstly, it's raised with her just after Christmas by the Conway Daily Sun in an interview that was then syndicated around the world. But then much more significantly, she goes on the Jimmy Kimmel show, and this comes up. And not only does she talk about it, but she makes a very interesting statement. She says, and by the way, there's a new terminology for this, UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, not UFO. Why is that significant? One reason it's significant is that we in the Ministry of Defense used the phrase UAP in place of UFO because of the pop culture baggage that the term UFO had acquired. And we deliberately used it, particularly in highly classified internal discussions and documentation, like the highly classified intelligence assessment, Project Condign. Indeed, the full technical title of the intelligence study, informally known as Project Condign, is Unidentified Aerial Phenomena in the United Kingdom Air Defense Region. But again, the key point is we used UAP. Now, I'm actually one of the few people in this field, I believe, who has actually met John Podesta. That was back in June of 2011. I briefed him on the MOD's UFO project, and I briefed him in particular on our use of the term UAP and how it was a device, a mechanism whereby we could get away from the trivialization of the issue, and internally we could have a serious discussion about it and say, what are we dealing with here? And how should we respond? And how should we play this with the media and the public? And it's interesting to see that Hillary Clinton and John Podesta are now using this term, getting it out into the media. And I don't want to directly claim responsibility for that, because the MOD had used the term actually for some years before I joined the UFO project. But during my watch, we were very mindful of the benefits of this. And I was certainly the one who briefed it to John Podesta. And though I don't know the exact route, it's clear that Podesta has briefed it to Hillary Clinton. And I guess my only surprise, and I don't want to get political here, I want to be bipartisan in this, but I'm surprised that Donald Trump hasn't really raised this, because it's a very easy win for him in one respect to say, well, I'm concerned about terrorism and the economy and jobs and tax, and my opponent, well, she seems interested in little green men. So there's an easy hit for him there, and I'm kind of surprised he hasn't taken it yet. It will be very interesting to see if and how Donald Trump plays that. But I'm surprised it's been put out there in these interviews at all, but it's out there in the Jimmy Kimmel show. I'm not suggesting UFOs is going to be an election issue. I don't think it is. I think it is going to come down to the usual things that people care about: taxation, jobs, the economy, defense, security, immigration, etc. All the usual things. I don't see UFOs as an election issue, but I see it as a potential curveball that could cause problems for either candidate if they're caught unawares by this. So it's interesting that far from running away from this question, Podesta and Clinton have kind of put it out there. Maybe they're getting it out there first before the debates, if indeed those presidential debates happen. I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens there. But I would not rule out, even if this isn't an issue with the media and the public, and the opinion polls don't suggest it is, but I would not rule out in one of those presidential debates this question coming up. And if it does, this might be the one time where, instead of being batted away with a joke, as happens where it comes up at the White House briefings, this might be the one time, depending on who's moderating these debates and how she or he plays it, this might be the one time where Trump and Clinton have to look down the barrel of the camera and really give a straight answer on this. So there are potentially some very interesting times ahead. I don't know how it's going to pan out, but watch this space. We're in for potentially one heck of a ride. And with those remarks out of the way, I believe I've now spoken for almost exactly an hour. Thank you. I've enjoyed being a part of this. Thank you to those who were here live, and I'm sure people who weren't able to do that can access the material afterwards. So thank you very much, Alan, and thank you everyone else.